Okay, we are starting our last unit on selection and adaptation. So first, we're going to look at our learning targets. These you're going to paste on page 137, and just like normal, you're going to take your highlighter and mark where you think you are with each target. So just kind of a heads up about these. I know there looks like a lot, there's 6 of them. The first 2 are sort of their own separate learning targets. And then all of the last 4 are, I guess, what we would call evidences that go with this concept of how organisms can change over time. And so these actually will kind of look familiar to you probably already, but those all sort of go together. So the first one is, can you construct an explanation based on evidence that describes how genetic variation, this is a word you're going to learn today, of traits in a population increase some individuals' probability of surviving and reproducing in a specific environment. So again, if you know all about genetic variations and you know the idea of surviving and reproducing, sometimes it's called survival of the fittest, if you could already explain that, then you're probably farther along. But go ahead and mark where you think you are. Everyone for sure is starting. Okay. Next on the list, we have gather and synthesize information about technologies that have changed the way humans influence the inheritance of desired traits in organism. Basically, what this one is artificial selection. So if you know what artificial selection is, then you are probably farther along. If you have no idea what that is, then I would say you are starting. Okay. Now into the evidences. Number 3 is analyze and interpret data for patterns in the fossil record. Well, if you've been with this class since the beginning of the year, we started with fossil record and talking about how Earth has changed over time. So this relates to this content, as well as the idea that, hey, the laws that operate today also operated the same way in the past. Okay, 4th on the list, explaining anatomical similarities and differences among organisms to see how they are related to each other and connected. So there's something called homologous structures that you'll be learning about, and that's what that is. If you already know what that is, then you can mark yourself farther, but probably you're starting that one as well. And then 5th is looking at embryological development across species. So making comparisons between one species to another as they develop, really before they're fully formed. And what are the similarities and differences? Everyone probably is starting unless you already have done something like that before. And then finally, looking at how mathematical representations come into play that support how natural selection may lead to increases and decreases of specific traits in populations over time. So actually, you guys will learn this word, populations, today as well. So if you already know what a population is, you might be a little farther in getting there, but probably we're in the starting range. Let's begin. So before we get into more of these concepts and activities around them, we have to make sure that we understand some basic vocabulary. So that's really what this lesson is all about. And this is your next page that you just got today, and you're going to paste that in on page 139. The first word here is species. So a species is a group of organisms that successfully reproduce among themselves. So if organisms belong to 2 separate species, they cannot mate to produce offspring that are able to reproduce. So for instance, with our spider picture here, we've got a bunch of what are called happy face spiders. And they all look different from each other, but technically they all belong to the same species, which is this, Theridion grallator. So species is usually just a human invention because we like to organize things. Sometimes it's hard to place organisms into species categories. For example, what about hybrids? You guys learned about mules, which we get from crossing a donkey and a horse. Or what about zonkies, or zedonks, which you get by crossing a zebra and a donkey? Are they separate species? If you go by the strict definition we just laid out, they wouldn't be their own species because they cannot interbreed with each other. You cannot get more zonkies by mating zonkies. They're sterile because of their mixed up chromosomes. But, in some cases too, you have organisms that are doing this in nature. These are two separate species of carrion crows, and they make hybrids. Would this be its own species? And what about organisms that only breed asexually? So just remember that when we think about what a species is, we are sort of putting a human definition on something going on in nature that sometimes doesn't always fall into that definition. There's also dogs, which I'll just point out now. Dogs are all the same species. Sometimes people aren't sure because look at all the variety that you get in the dog species. And a lot of that is human generated, and we'll talk more about that. That's what we call artificial selection. Another word you need to know is population. So population is a group of organisms in a certain area. So the organisms can be any living thing. It doesn't, I know when we say this word, a lot of times we think people, but it can be plants, animals, bugs, whatever living thing we are talking about. And when we say an area, that's just defined by whoever's examining that organism. It could be something as large as a whole country, like the United States, or it could be just a tiny patch of grass in your backyard. The population boundary is what you make it. The word variation, you guys have heard before because we talked about the variation of traits in organisms, like for instance facial features we just did with Design a Kid. Here's the definition. It's an appearance of an inherited trait that makes an individual different from other members of the same species, which usually comes from a mutation, and more on mutations in a second. If you look at these populations of ladybugs, right, there's different ranges of colors and patterns, and that would be genetically controlled, and that would be considered variation. They're all the same species, but they don't all look alike. Same here with the snails. There's different patterns and color variation. Not all members of a species look or act alike. Back to mutation. Mutation is just change in the genetic code. We know that that middle part of the DNA ladder is made up of those letters A, C, T, and G. And when DNA gets copied, sometimes the bases get paired incorrectly, or something gets deleted, or something gets added in extra that shouldn't be there. And that changes the protein that is being made for that gene. So that can either be helpful or it can be harmful depending on what happens, or sometimes there's no effect depending on where it is. And a lot of times being exposed to chemicals or radiation will help promote mutations depending on the cells exposed. So you might imagine that these different colors in these parakeets may have arisen from a mutation and not one that's necessarily harmful. Perhaps one color is more beneficial in certain environment than another. And you saw a video potentially earlier about the mutations in fruit flies, and flies have a lot of mutations, and here you can see a few of them. Some wingless, some have different shaped eyes, different color eyes. So some of those mutations might be harmful, some of them might be beneficial. It sort of depends on the environment. Here again are some other examples, right? We have some different color patterns on these birds. Here's a really extreme one, right? A two-headed animal, in this case a turtle. Slight variation of color in these flowers. And you'll hear about a few more of these in the Brain Pop, which we're going to watch right now.
Look, for four-leaf clover. Whoa. Dear Tim and Moby, what's a genetic mutation? From Andy. Genetic mutations are permanent changes to a cell's DNA or RNA. Deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid are the chemical blueprints for your entire body. Every living organism has genetic material that controls all of its body's function. This material also determines physical traits. Some, like eye color, are completely controlled by your genes, while others, like height, are a product of genes plus environment. Sometimes the genetic code changes. No, most of these changes do nothing at all. They're corrected by DNA repair, so they don't become permanent mutations. But when mutations do become permanent, they're usually deleterious or bad. Cells depend on thousands of proteins to work properly. Mutations can mess up the genes that are responsible for making these proteins. For example, sickle cell anemia, a blood disease, is caused by a very small mutation in a protein encoding gene. Cancer is the result of deleterious mutations that cause uncontrolled cell growth. Occasionally, a mutation is beneficial and helps an organism survive. Beneficial genetic mutations are thought to be one of the driving forces of evolution. That's the process that makes organisms change over a number of generations. Organisms with beneficial mutations survive better and are more likely to pass on their mutated genes. Oh, mutations can be caused by lots of different things. Sometimes they happen spontaneously or randomly during cell division. Mutation can also be caused by outside forces like chemicals, radiation, and viruses. Wow, that's kind of neat. Hey, maybe we should tell some scientists about this thing. Oh. What? Ow! Whoa! Why did you do that? You're weird.
Next word is adaptation. It is adaptation, not adaption. And it's any variation or difference that makes an organism better suited to its environment. So if it's a trait that is giving an organism an advantage in a particular environment, we would call that an adaptation. So for instance, here, the cheetah's adaptation, right, is that it's got a pretty small frame and long legs that help it run very fast, and it can catch its prey that way. That's an adaptation for catching prey. That's a beneficial difference or variation. So examples in organisms in general would be maybe potentially color, their shape, some kind of pattern on their body, their behavior, or any other chemical makeup, any other thing that's being determined by a gene. If an organism's not well adapted to its environment, it will die. It doesn't have the best traits for living in its environment. If it is well adapted to its environment, its chances of surviving and living long enough to reproduce and pass on its genes are increased. So that's definitely a good thing. So again, some variations are considered adaptations. So for instance, with the elephant, its trunk is prehensile, which means it can pick up things very easily. It acts like a finger. Their ears are huge. We saw a clip about them being able to cool off with their ears. The tusks, right, are there for defending themselves, and sometimes it's used as a tool. And how they walk on their tiptoes helps them support their weight. Before we go any further, we just want to review what is a predator, what is a prey. Now I want you guys to think about some examples of adaptations. We're going to talk about this bat first. So bats usually feed by catching insects at night. Bats locate insects by giving off high-frequency sounds as they fly. These sounds bounce off insects and return to the bat. So I want you to list 3 adaptations that are shown in the picture. You can see them in the picture that help the bat in catching food. So in this case, I want you to just focus on what are the adaptations bats have for catching food. Okay, now it doesn't really matter the order that you wrote these in, but hopefully you mentioned this, right? These high frequency sounds that the bat is making. Technically, that's called echolocation. So the bat emits the sounds, they bounce off the insects or whatever they're trying to catch, and then the bat also has these giant ears which allow them to act like catcher's mitts that catch the sounds, and they actually are finding and locating their prey that way. Have you ever heard the word or term blind as a bat? Do bats have good vision? No, they do not. So this is primarily how they are finding their food. Other things you might have mentioned, just the fact that they can fly, right? And they are able to catch their prey that also flies. Fish have a number of predators. Birds such as pelicans or gulls feed on fish. Large fish often feed on other smaller fish. So let's think about two adaptations that the fish have to avoid predators. So in this case, we're not looking for adaptations that help fish find food. We are looking for how they avoid becoming food. Okay, hopefully you noticed that the pattern of the fish is different depending on what side you're looking at. The belly of the fish tends to be very much light, okay, and that is to avoid predators that might be lurking from below. So if you have a much larger fish looking around for their dinner, if they look up, this is going to help this fish blend into the sky above because it looks whitish. And then if you've got birds looking down into a body of water for their meal, the dark color on top helps it blend into the dark bottom of the pond or ocean or river. So it is like camouflage. This technically is called counter shading, and you guys will hear more about this in our next couple activities. These two words you probably know something about already. The words are camouflage and mimicry. So both of these allow organisms to blend into their environment in order to do just what we were talking about, either avoid predators so that they don't become someone's food, or to help them catch prey. So there's so many different examples of this, and you guys are going to watch a fabulous video that you'll love about this. But some of the examples you might write down could be just having stripes or this coloration that lets you blend into your environment. Colors that are like camouflage. This one here, you can hardly see, this is a flounder blended into the sea bottom. Or disguises. In this case, we have well, both of these. You have bugs that look like leaves, and in this case, we have a butterfly that's disguising itself as the eyes of the owl that would scare away a potential bird predator. Okay, so you finished your notes. Now what? Well, we have more on this topic tomorrow. Another fun activity around camouflage and mimicry. So for now, though, you can go ahead and start the next activity in Canvas called Life Through Time. And the beginning of the worksheet looks like this.